Thank you so much for including me in this amazing gathering of so many people committed to children's well-being. I thank you for your work, and I hope that my song and dance will be exciting enough to give you the encouragement you're wanting to take some next steps toward addressing the traumatic experiences that children who come into care have. That was a great introduction, because I'm going to be talking this morning about how do we come to terms with both parts of the traumatic experience that children have who are in care. We so often are thinking only about the trauma of maltreatment that preceded the decision to remove. And many people are very pessimistic about children's capacity to recover from the maltreatment that they've experienced. But children's experience of maltreatment prior to coming into care is extremely varied. Not all children have been physically or sexually abused. The vast majority in care have been neglected, and there's been very little research about what are the traumas that children experience from neglect. What we so often do is forget about the other trauma, the one that's inflicted by separation from family. And we don't like to talk about that because it's the unintended consequence of a good safety decision. Nonetheless, in protecting the safety of children by removing them from a situation that is not meeting their safety needs, we cause trauma. And that's universal for children who come into care. And it is the single greatest cause of both placement breakdown, which, as you know, multiple placement predicts, to continuing multiple placement, and the trauma experienced by children from separating from their families greatly affects reunification because of the struggle that families have in understanding their children's new emotional needs as a result of coming into care. And those express themselves in visits. So we're going to be moving this morning through what the latest research on trauma is to try to look at the question of how you can use positive family time in visits to address the trauma that children have experienced, particularly trauma associated with separation from families. The PowerPoint that I'm using is on your CD, along with an article that I've written about visit coaching. So I'm hoping that that will relieve you from excessive note-taking. We're going to start this morning in talking about children in foster care who are coping with loss and other trauma with the story of Nadia. Nadia is a 5-year-old who's been suspended from Head Start and is in her second foster home placement in 3 months because of her aggression at 5. She tells her story like this. I am Nadia. I am 5. My mom is sick. Sometimes she is home. Sometimes she's in the hospital. My dad takes care of us. One night, my dad did not come home. The next morning, we were hungry and knocked on the neighbor's door. She did not know where our dad was. In the afternoon, someone came to her apartment and took us in her car. My sister was crying for my mom. They took her to the doctor. One of them took me to a house. I asked them whether my dad was there, and they didn't know where he was. I waited for my sister on the couch. They did not know where my sister was. A boy told me it was time for dinner. I said I didn't care. He said, "Don't be stupid." I kicked him. They told me to sleep in a room, and a girl who made ugly faces at me was sleeping in the other bed. I did not want to sleep there. I went back to the couch to wait for my sister. Every day, the two other kids here who are bigger than me say mean things. I kick them and punch them. I keep asking about my sister. What assumptions might the foster parent be making about this 5-year-old's aggression, which is causing so much trouble in their home and was causing so much trouble at Head Start? The foster parent might logically assume that Nadia was physically abused before she came into care, or that Nadia was exposed to domestic violence before she came into care. Her foster parent may believe that there's little that can be done about a child whose parents would leave her home alone, taking care of a sick little sister. The foster parent may feel they're doing the best that they can to give her a loving home. They may feel there's not much they can do about Nadia's aggression, or about having to ask to have her removed from their home if her aggression continues. Abuse and exposure to domestic violence might be part of what would cause a 5-year-old to be aggressive. But in this situation, it's not part of Nadia's story. She wasn't physically abused or exposed to domestic violence, as far as anyone knows. If we look behind her behavior, we see that Nadia has suddenly lost all the important people in her life. She has lost what was her life. She worried about her mother and little sister as she was growing up, and now they've disappeared. Her father was their protector, and now he's not here. As a result, she is pretty sensitive about rejection. When someone tells her no, she feels mistreated. She is so anxious about her mother and her sister that she copes by trying to be in charge, controlling what little a 5-year-old can control. And as a result, small changes in her routine cause her to overreact in aggressive behavior. Trauma can interfere with all aspects of a developing child's life. Of course, repeated losses, repeated instances of abuse can cause a child to have even more effects of trauma. While other children are doing their normal developmental work, the traumatized child is distracted. It's no surprise that Nadia is not mastering the skills being taught in Head Start, that she's not learning her colors, that she's not learning to get along with other children, that she's not learning how to make transitions from one activity to another that would prepare her for kindergarten and first grade. She is totally preoccupied by all that she has lost. She is, in effect, still sitting on the couch, waiting for her sick sister. We see in Nadia all these reactions to loss. She is delayed for a 5-year-old. She is sad. She is angry and aggressive. She's having problems regulating her emotions. And all of these reactions to loss are making her behavior very difficult for the foster parent to manage. What would the attachment research with which most of you are familiar tell us about Nadia's behavior? Well, the attachment research would say that children who've received consistent, responsive caregiving, particularly in their first 3 years of life, have had brain development that will support more successful attachments. So that might be good news for Nadia, because she's so strongly attached to family members. She might be able to make other attachments more easily than those children who in the first years of life have not had a strong attachment, and whose foster parents or relative caregivers are working uphill trying to help that child who was previously not strongly attached form a new attachment to them as the current caregiver. But what we must not lose sight of in the attachment research are all the findings about loss of a caregiver with whom the child had an attachment, and the loss associated with multiple caregivers. It's the attachment research, as much as it is the bad outcomes in foster care, that tell us that multiple placements are harmful to children. That an attachment that's lost to one foster parent or relative caregiver will have a traumatic effect on the child that can be lasting. Maybe more children than we realize are like Nadia, who enter care with strong attachments, and their loss is devastating. Foster parents and relative caregivers find children like Nadia difficult because they are so needy. She is so wanting of her parents to care for her, and so angry that these people are not them. And of these children's tendency to fall apart so quickly, that emotional dysregulation that gets talked about so much. And yet they are so difficult to comfort because the foster parent or relative caregiver is not their primary attachment. The experience of trauma represents for children a loss of the developmentally appropriate expectation that their parents will protect them. And the application of all of Joy Osofsky's research applies both to children whose parents didn't protect them adequately, and so the children didn't have what they needed in the way of protection at home before they came into care, and they are emotionally dysregulated as a result, and to the children like Nadia, who, as a result of entering care, fall apart because they no longer have the protection of the parent or parents to whom they were attached. And for her, of course, we mustn't forget her sister, who's a very important missing attachment that she's grieving. Sean Koff and the other researchers at the Developing Child Research Program at Harvard are now bringing together a lot of the findings that he is calling the legacies of biological disruption from adversity. Those findings are that toxic stress disrupts both brain circuits, so brain development, and overloads the child's stress response system, so that the child's brain develops differently as a result of being exposed to stress, extreme stress, and the child's immune system, heart rate, and stress hormones are altered as a result. Now, these findings, and those with which you're no doubt familiar from Perry, were causing child welfare professionals to be pretty pessimistic for a while there. If it alters early brain development, what can we do about it? But the message from the Developing Child Project is that children who have experienced significant adversity are responding very positively to specific kinds of early intervention, and that they do catch up, that both their brain development and their stress response system can be altered by strategic, specific intervention. And the three things that Sean Koff's group is emphasizing is, first, stable and supportive relationships are the primary treatment. So they are underlining the importance of children remaining in one placement if they are removed. Secondly, a language-rich environment. So all of their work goes toward parents, foster parents, and relative caregivers in increasing the talk between children, very young children, middle-aged children, preteens, and teens. The talk between the adult and the child. And they have developed this term called serve and return. What they're trying to support between adults and children is what we all know so much about, the give and take, the so-called reciprocal communication that is key to attachment, is also key to brain development, repair work, and stress response system repair work. So teaching adults how to do that give and take all the time with children of all ages. There is really good news for foster children. from the brain science that I want to emphasize. Really good news that children in foster care who are at the greatest risk of some of the developmental consequences of exposure to trauma can be helped. And there's increasing information about what interventions mitigate the effects of trauma on children. And an important finding of this research is that both parents, who if the child is in foster care, this would occur in visits, both parents and foster parents and relative caregivers can manage difficult children, that is, children whose behavior is reflecting the effects of trauma, by the kind of training programs that have been developed for them. And the consequences are, in the research that's been done with these interventions, that the improvements that foster parents, relative caregivers make almost stops placement breakdown and increases safe reunification. So these efforts started with the idea of mitigating the effects of trauma on children and ended up with very positive outcomes about placement and placement stability and reunification. There are 6 evidence-based interventions that are focusing on serve and return that are getting the most attention right now. And they are increasing the responsiveness of parents and of foster parents and relative caregivers to the child's emotional needs. So here are 3 of them. Preventive intervention for maltreated preschool children, the ABC program, Attachment Biobehavioral Catch-up, the Family Checkup. You don't have to take notes on this because you've got it in your CD. And then the Safe Care program, Parent-Child Therapy, including PCIT, and Incredible Years. Now, these are 6 programs that have research using randomized clinical studies that have found that parents, foster parents, and relative caregivers' responsiveness to children's needs is greatly enhanced by these interventions. The good news from these 6 evidence-based programs is that children in foster care exposed to trauma both before removal and as a result of removal can recover, especially when there is support for both their parents and the individuals caring for them now, that acknowledges that the child has been affected by trauma and separation and loss. How can these 6 programs and the findings of the Harvard group influence our daily work with children in care? Well, for this we need another story about Hector. Hector's almost 2 years old. When she was 15, his mom fell in love with an 18-year-old and got pregnant. Her parents called the police. Her boyfriend was deported. Her parents blamed each other for her getting into that relationship and getting pregnant. They separated, and their 3 children and Hector moved between them. Hector's grandfather's drinking got a lot worse during this period of time. Hector's mom was a devoted mother. She went to 10th grade, fortunately, in a school that had a daycare center. And she spent all the rest of her time taking care of Hector and helping with her younger siblings. One night when her father passed out, a friend who had been drinking with him in their home raped Hector's 13-year-old aunt in their home. And CPS investigated and removed Hector over his mother's and grandparents' objections. Hector isn't quite 2, so he's only got a few words. But if he could talk, he might say, "A lady put me in her car and took me to a house. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have my red blankie. They made me sleep in a big bed with no one else. It was dark. I want my mother. They gave me something yucky that was brown and had raisins in a bowl with milk. It was gross. I want my red blankie. I want rice. I don't want to sleep alone. I want my mother." I keep saying this over and over. They don't understand me. Hector's foster parents are having trouble with his temper tantrums, which happen a lot. And logically enough, his foster parents are thinking that his mother must not have been tuned in very well to his distress, or he wouldn't be having temper tantrums like this. He must have an insecure or poor attachment to his family. His mother must have modeled poor emotional regulation. His mother must not have had a consistent bedtime, because going to bed is a big problem for Hector. Now, this list of the foster parents' assumptions about attachment, attunement, and emotional regulation problems could well contribute to a 2-year-old's difficulty in managing his feelings. But his mother would say that none of them are accurate about her loving, strong relationship with Hector. If we look behind Hector's temper tantrums, we see that he's being overwhelmed by feelings that he can't express. His feelings of loss are too much for him. He can't soothe himself, but he can't ask for help. He was used to being soothed by family members who could read his needs and didn't have to rely on him communicating much about them, certainly not communicating in words. Children respond, of course, very differently to the experience of trauma from before they enter care and the experience of separation and loss. Not everyone's going to respond like Hector. A child's unique temperament frames their response to trauma. And as Osofsky has pointed out, reserved children, those who are reserved by temperament, tend to respond to trauma with what psychologists have called internalizing. Those are children who have numbing and withdraw and don't explore and have lots of fears and anxiety about separation. Children who are outgoing by temperament are more likely to respond with so-called externalizing behaviors, such as temper tantrums, or in older children, reckless behavior, aggression, and defiance. So this means that children in the same family who may have been exposed to the same trauma at home prior to removal, and of course they have experienced separation from the same family members, will react very differently given their different ages and their different temperaments. So it's not unusual for a foster parent or relative caregiver to complain, but her brother's doing fine in school. I don't know what her problem is. And that often leads to a belief that one child is more emotionally disturbed or has other problems that can't be addressed with normal supports from the foster parent or relative caregiver. It is, of course, very hard for a foster parent or relative caregiver, or for that matter, a parent during visits, to respond differently to each child's very different reaction to the loss that they've experienced. That's a complicated process of tailoring the give and take between the adult and the child, not only to the child's developmental stage, but also to the temperamentally informed different reactions to trauma and to separation and loss. Hector's temperament is outgoing, and he is protesting loudly all that he has lost. He's not verbal enough to tell us this. So we have to struggle hard in a team with his parents who are visiting and with the foster parents who are caring for him, to put together our ideas of what are Hector's emotional needs at this point behind those behaviors. This is really a challenge because we all react to children's behaviors. And the more difficult to manage the behavior, the more likely we are to say, what am I going to do about the temper tantrum, the crying, the night fears, the night wetting, the conflict with other children, the withdrawal, and as children get older, the more dangerous behaviors that desperate children have that can harm others as well as themselves. We all tend to focus on behavior, and it distracts us from asking the question, what is the unique need driving this behavior in this child? And how could I meet it? How could I meet it if I were the parent in visits? How could I meet it if I were the caseworker? How could a service provider meet it, whether that was a teacher or a therapist or other? And if I'm a foster parent or relative caregiver, how would I meet that need? We each have a different role to play in meeting the need behind a behavior. And our effectiveness will not be furthered if we just keep talking about the behavior, which is a problem for everyone. So as you're doing your family group conferencing or whatever form of family meeting you have, I would encourage you to use the discipline of the child's needs as a way of helping everyone get on the same page in understanding the behaviors that everyone might have come together to talk about. Just one of you in a team meeting being stubborn and asking the question, what's your hunch about what might be behind Hector's temper tantrums and sleep problems? And to hear what a parent thinks about that. what a foster parent or relative caregiver thinks about that, what the caseworker, what the teacher. Each person has a different hunch perhaps, but that's the way we all get on the same page and help each other then figure out, well, what should I do to meet that need? Hector is crying out like Nadia for comfort and reassurance. Although what one of the 6 programs that I highlighted before has demonstrated is that many children like Hector and Nadia who protest so loudly actually give off a message of, I don't want help, get away from me. Both their behaviors and their response to assistance has been, leave me alone. They're not, as this intervention says, they're not appealing children to help. And what that's done to many foster parents and relative caregivers is to make them back away and make them say, this is a very difficult child to help, not responsive to my reassurance. And without being aware of it, they focus their loving attention much more on other children in the home. And likewise, a parent who is encountering this kind of distancing in a visit, which may not be because of what happened before the child came into care, although of course if the child was abused or exposed to violence, it could be the child pushing back against the parent because of what they exposed him or her to. But the parent could be encountering this for the first time in the child because the child is pushing back because they are angry about loss. And they come into the visit looking mad. This is pretty shocking to a parent who is eager to see their child and wasn't ready for that unappealing child, the child who doesn't want to snuggle up right away. And we might erroneously conclude that that's because there isn't a strong attachment between the child and the parent, rather than getting it that this is this particular child's unique protest about what's gone on. And both that parent in the visit and that foster parent or relative caregiver require support from someone to say, that's exactly the child you have to go to. Don't let them discourage you. So one of those 6 programs is basically an anti-discouragement program that gives direction to parents and foster parents and relative caregivers how to give the reassurance this child's behavior shows he or she needs, even though his actions look like he wants nothing to do with you. The younger the child, of course, the less of this they're able to communicate. And because we have such a large number of children in foster care who are too young to communicate their own needs, it puts much more pressure on us to figure out what's behind their behavior and not to just focus on physical needs. 2-year-olds have significant emotional needs. And too often, when we write about young children, we focus on physical safety and physical care, even though most children are safe and well cared for in foster homes and relative caregivers. In fact, most children are safe and relatively well cared for physically in most visits. And when we initially might talk about children's needs, we might just think about safety needs and stop there. But it's the emotional needs behind these behaviors that we all requires schooling in how to identify and how to meet. And very young children have significant emotional needs. Hector, for example, at 2, could become depressed as a result of the loss that he has experienced. And certainly Nadia, as you heard her story, was showing signs of depression. Depression is not commonly diagnosed in traumatized children, and yet it is the single most common characteristic of traumatized children. And here I'm not speaking of children with PTSD, not the full-blown symptoms of flashbacks and other trauma reactions, often from physical or sexual abuse, but children traumatized by separation and loss often have depression that gets ignored because their behavior distracts us so much from understanding what is behind it. Depressed children in elementary school right now are the largest, who are in foster care, are the largest group of children not receiving trauma treatment. They have been traumatized by what happened prior to coming into care and by separation and loss. And many of them are depressed in elementary school and are so delayed that they are far behind their grade level in school, not necessarily because of disabilities, but because of their own efforts to cope with trauma. And they are not being referred for trauma treatment, surprisingly. They are the group of children with the highest number of multiple placements. And they're children who we tend to say to foster parents and relative caregivers, deal with it. Love him. Things will improve with Nadia. That's not helpful to a foster parent or a relative caregiver who is the number one person able to respond with support to the needs that are driving the behaviors that will cause the placement to break down. We often wait for that official notification from the foster parent that they can't take it any longer. But every foster parent knows long before that this child is headed toward the breakdown of that placement. And yet there are few resources giving support to especially relative caregivers. Children with untreated trauma move from elementary school to middle school. And we all know that this is when a lot of crash and burn happens. The adjustment to middle school is difficult for children who are not stressed by being in foster care. And the difficulty in regulating emotions, doing the schoolwork, and having normal peer relationships really becomes apparent in middle school for the child with untreated trauma. And then, of course, we move along to adolescence. And both in the children that we work with who have been teenagers and have been in care for some time, and teenagers who come into care as adolescents or early adolescents. We know that trauma is a primary contributor to delinquency. And yet there is little trauma treatment provided to children in adolescence. Again, because then we tend to move them over to the delinquency court where their behavior is the focus. Many young people enter the delinquency system from child welfare, as you all know, often with the symptoms of trauma that never got treated while they were in care, and their behavior problems not being deciphered, the question not being asked, what's behind this conduct problem? Let's meet another child, Tiffany, who was neglected, who was not removed, who did not receive services, and now has been arrested as a young teen. Tiffany was born to a 17-year-old mother who used drugs and alcohol while she was pregnant with her. They lived in her grandparents' public housing apartment. Her father was killed when she was 2. Her grandfather died in the home when she was 7. Starting in kindergarten, Child Protective Services were repeatedly called by the school and by a church where Tiffany was begging for food. Here's the summary from the CPS report when she was 9, and I'm quoting: poor supervision, poor nutrition, unsanitary living environment, and poor parenting. Her grandmother is primary caretaker. Although mother resides in the home, she provides little nurturance, discipline, emotional, or financial support. There is often conflict between mother and grandmother over Tiffany. The household is chaotic as numerous relatives parade in and out. Family members sleep on couches or on mattresses with no sheets. Meal preparation is sporadic. Tiffany has poor school attendance because she has few clothes. Her mother rejected her, and Tiffany has been harshly physically disciplined for years. That is the CPS summary. At age 12, Tiffany was arrested for stealing food from a store. At 13, she was arrested for getting in a fight with girls who picked on her for her shabby clothes and her family. The effects of repeated trauma on Tiffany were described in a court mental health report. At times, she is so overwhelmed and exhausted by worries and troubles that she feels hopeless and depleted. This is a 13-year-old. She cares for her family, but is acutely aware of the pervasiveness of their problems, which weigh heavily on her. Caring for others in the family sometimes keeps her from caring for herself. Tiffany sees the world as a hazardous place where she must confront dangers without help from others. In the research on female development would add a little bit to our understanding of why Tiffany is the way that she is. So looking behind her behavior, we might see some of these characteristics of teen girls. The findings of research are that girls experience more life events than boys in the same family. That girls are more upset by stress, are prone to see themselves as helpless, fear abandonment by others, and express a greater need for closeness and nurturing than boys. Girls report significantly lower levels of self-worth and satisfaction with their social and academic achievement than boys, even when they get higher grades. Many girls who seem to be resilient appear to lose self-confidence at age 11 and 12, the middle school problems of girls so familiar to all of you. And connection with others is the central organizing feature of development in girls. Their focus on relationships creates a concern over loss of closeness that can be all a girl thinks about. So these are vulnerabilities for all girls in all social classes, and affect as like a kind of overlay on the loss and trauma of a girl like Tiffany. The court intervened in the delinquency matter by the radical decision to send Tiffany to a child welfare group home, which didn't make everybody happy, as you can imagine. Child welfare objected since she wasn't in an open case, and probation objected because it seemed like a wimpy response to a charge of assault on another girl. But this system had no therapeutic foster home program, and they had no experience in wrapping intensive services around a conventional foster home to make it be adequate for a girl with the high needs that Tiffany had. Everyone probably knew that a group home placement wasn't going to be optimal. This is a child who has tremendous needs, is very focused on wanting relationship, wanting to be cared for. And even the best group home provider is going to have to do a lot of focus on control and on spreading the attention evenly among children so that this desperately needy 13-year-old who has delayed development because of all that she's experienced is unlikely to do well in group care. She also wasn't referred for trauma treatment. So what happened next? We see that traumatized youth tend to misinterpret things. They tend to see benign things that people say or do and misinterpret it as hostility. They're very sensitive. When anyone calls them a name, they're easily triggered. They have often had difficulty since childhood modulating their reactions, perhaps because of what was happening to them at home and not learning emotional regulation at home. And all of this gets put into aggression. But behind the aggression is this misinterpreting as hostile what others say, and a difficulty putting feelings into words and keeping those feelings regulated. So these youth are often, because of trauma, surprised by how quickly they escalate, and they're unable to control their angry outbursts. Just one little name calling can make them go through the roof in terms of their reaction. You all know Tiffany. Both the girl and the boy form of a traumatized teen who's unable to control their overreaction. Tiffany's caregiver, whether it's a foster parent or a group home provider, requires a lot of support, not just to manage this behavior, but to do something to meet the needs that drive this quick escalation by the teen. But when we talk with foster parents and group home providers and relative caregivers, they often don't see the reflexive response to provocation as being the result of trauma. They often think the kid is bad, the kid is out of control, The kid is bipolar. The kid has conduct disorder. So the behavior gets labeled without someone saying, oh, wait a minute. Trauma might be driving this behavior. What does the kid need when they start to overreact? And important in this process of learning for group home providers, school staff, foster parents, and others is, of course, to understand that kids react this way as a reflex. They aren't able to think to stop themselves, partly because they have adolescent thinking problems, but also because this is a reflex they've gotten into, a habit of protecting themselves because of prior victimization. It seems counterintuitive when I work with group home providers and I help them examine how much of their day is spent with Tiffany praising her rather than criticizing her or controlling her. They give a look that indicates, wait a minute, there's nothing to praise there. Why do you want us to praise this girl who is ripping up our group home? And the answer is a basic parenting answer, of course, that praise is more effective than punishment. But that requires really a reworking of many foster homes and relative caregivers and group homes. Most adults working with these young people who've been traumatized and having these reactions don't recognize that they can prevent most of the behaviors from occurring. But they require a lot of support to learn how to avoid the power struggles, how to de-escalate the child before they get out of control, and how to teach children how not to be so rejection sensitive and what to do with their angry feelings. So we've met now 3 traumatized children in different kinds of placements, different stories. Nadia, who's 5, and Hector, who's 2, and Tiffany, who's 13. What can we learn from them about how to modify our care for children exposed to trauma and loss? First of all, as I said in the beginning, removal and placement are always traumatic for children, no matter what the circumstances. That even in abusive homes, there is a loss of everything familiar to the child when they come into placement. And the attachment between the child and the parent is affected by the separation. We've learned that the child's first placement in foster care should be the child's only placement because children need consistent caregiving, and multiple moves disrupt their attachments and can affect the child's ability to build relationships. We've learned that training for foster parents and relative caregivers should include information about attachment, but not just theoretical information. How that knowledge can applies to the children in their home, so they can support the child's attachment to the individuals they have been separated from, and so they can build attachment through this reciprocal give and take, language-rich environment that they're going to provide. And in this context of understanding child trauma, foster parents have to have far more awareness of how children's visit reactions are the result of children's trauma before coming into care and their reactions to being separated from their family, then seeing their family, then separating again from their family. Children's visit reactions are very disruptive in foster and relative homes, but they're very poorly understood. And often foster parents will complain and say, I think these visits are harmful, they should stop, without really appreciating where the visit reactions are coming from. How do we help a foster parent or a relative caregiver or parent get stuck on that problem behavior, whether it's post-visit behavior or the temper tantrums and sleep problems of the children that I described? How do we help foster parents and relative caregivers who have to live with these behaviors all day, every day, get reminded that this is a child like Nadia or like Hector who desperately needs reassurance and attention because of the loss that they've experienced? How their give and take with the child isn't just for cognitive development, but also to meet the child's emotional needs. And parents, of course, also require that support. That's why the work you're doing in meetings that include foster parents and parents together is so important. Getting on the same page about what the child's needs are behind the behavior and who is going to meet those needs how. Even though the parent is only parenting in visits, they are still an important need meter of that child. The findings are that when foster parents and parents have a positive relationship, children feel reassured and safer. And this, I know, goes against a long history of keeping foster parents and parents separated. And it's not to suggest that now that this is known from research, every foster parent is instantly going to be turned overnight into someone who wants to have a relationship with the parent. This is a slow movement all across the country that as foster parents are willing to have relationships with some of the parents of the children in their home, they see that children improve as a result. And that reunification or another permanent plan moves forward more quickly when they have that communication. Visits are the place where parents meet children's needs. This is the place where the attachment between parents and their children can be supported. But visits, the way that they happen in traditional visit practice, often don't provide the kind of support that I've been talking about. Often don't help parents look at the needs behind their children's behavior. Often visits are not constructed in a way that helps the parents decipher why their child is reacting to them the way their child is. If we don't actively support sensitive responsiveness of parents to their children's needs during visits, this all-important give and take that the research is talking about, we miss one of the most important opportunities for mitigating the effects of trauma on children. We lose it. We don't have to have expensive therapists doing hundreds of hours of individual therapy with children if, for most children, we give support to the parent to respond to the loss and separation their child is feeling. But parents don't naturally know this. And it's an absurd expectation that a parent would just come to a visit and say, oh yeah, my child must be experiencing a lot of reactions to loss and separation, and I'm the mitigator. First, they might not be thinking that way about their children's emotional needs. They might not have quite such a sophisticated view. But probably more importantly, most parents don't get what visits are for. And we don't usually tell them because we think it should be obvious. So parents come to visits, and what they tell us when we've done work in visit improvement in the design of visit coaching is, when we ask them what the purpose of visits is, they say, visits are a hoop we have to jump through. The court wants to know that we visited. Well, that's a terrible way to come to a visit because it's a requirement. And then that visit, that message, is further reinforced by their belief that the person who's taking notes and not communicating with them during the visit is writing all sorts of bad stuff to tell the judge. So that puts a real damper on what the parent does in the visit. So when we started to say, well, let's just have a purpose for visits that we're going to announce to all parents. And what we started to say was, well, the purpose of visits is for children to have fun with their parents. Because that's really a pretty easy way of saying give and take, responsiveness to needs. Parents looked at us and said, oh no, the judge wouldn't want to know that we were having fun. And where does that idea come from? It's the assumption that they've been caught doing something bad, they're not clear what it was often, and that anything they do in a visit is just going to make their situation worse. So they should be highly controlled in visits, and the idea of having fun sounds like it would break that rule. Parents also are in denial, and visits is a big example of that. Most parents, no matter how effectively the caseworker has communicated to them, continue to insist that their children are going to return in a few weeks or months. Their time frame is very unrealistic. And that belief that my child is just about to return home then supports the parents in not viewing visits as being that crucial in the life of their child. Because as soon as my child is back home, everything will be fine. We know that's not true, and that their child is missing out on very important developmental time with them, and that every visit matters greatly to the development of their child. That's our view only. And we haven't found good ways of helping parents hear and endorse that view themselves, so they continue to not see the importance of visits in the lives of their children. And parents don't want to visit their children, especially not in an office, because visiting means saying goodbye. And many parents experience the end of a visit as being like the removal happening over and over and over again. And we don't do much to help parents be able to cope with the pain of that. Although we never intended this to happen, traditional supervised visits bring out the worst in everyone. The worst in the child, the worst in the parent, the worst in the foster parent, the worst in the caseworker. Supervised visits are an awful time burden for caseworkers. Many of them spend their time getting ready for the visit by all of the machinery of visits. You got to get these people in the room or another place. You got to get transportation. It's got to fit with the bus schedule. It's got to be this, and you got to have a room, and you have to have somebody to supervise. There are many offices around the country where a caseworker is spending every afternoon supervising multiple visits at the same time. So their hours of their life every day consist of moving from room to room for brief periods of time to provide supervision. Tremendously unrewarding and insult to their training as social workers. Not at all what they want to be doing. And foster parents are having to cope with the reactions of children to visits that I've described. So if you had 4 children in your home as a foster parent or a relative placement, 4 unrelated children who are having 4 different visits in the week, and they all came home just in time for dinner, sounds like 4 dinners out of 7 would be pretty awful, with somebody kicking or not being willing to come to the meal or not being willing to eat what's being served because they're reacting to having had a visit and saying goodbye. For children, of course, because of the limitations of many offices, we plan visits during the time that I don't want to be with my children. I don't know about you, but 4:30, last choice of time when I'd like to spend with my children. They're worn out, but don't admit it. They're hungry, but it's not time for dinner. They've had a bad day. I've had a bad day, but they've had a bad day. And then, of course, for our children who are coming into visits, who are riding for a long time in a car to get there, you add that as well. So they are not happy campers just coming to the visit at that hour. More and more offices are having weekend visits and are having visits in the foster home, and that reduces some of those stressors on children, of course. And then parents. Visits bring out the worst in parents. Parents who come to the visit, and what it does is to trigger in them all the feelings of anger and sadness about their child's removal. So a typical parent arrives at a visit late or in a rush. They get off the bus or they get there by some form of transportation. They haven't really had time to think about what it is they're coming to in terms of what their child needs for them. They walk in the door. They're flooded with feelings of sadness and anger, and that's how they walk into the visit room. All this baggage of feelings that they haven't been able to process, and those feelings get in the way of their being able to greet their children. And then many children walk into the visit and have their own reaction to the visit, which may not be to run with open arms into the arms of their parent, not because the child's attachment to the parent is weak, but because the child is having difficulty coping with all of their feelings. In the first 2 minutes of that visit, if you're the person supervising the visit, you just want to go home. Everybody is operating at their lowest capacity right then. So, and then we have to add to it that many parents themselves have trauma in their background. Many parents of kids in foster care themselves were in foster care. The loss of their children can precipitate reactions by parents, and especially those parents who have not fully grieved other losses in their life. We actually see them becoming more depressed at the time that their children come into care, and visits bring that out in them. When they come to visit their children, parents are overwhelmed by their own mixed feelings. And then when they separate from their child, they often have such strong feelings, it's hard for them to return to the next visit. And so we see poor attendance by parents. So visit coaching is an intervention that was developed specifically to support parents in visits, to help them be more responsive to their traumatized children, to acknowledge that their children have been affected by separation and loss, and to help the parents keep their own feelings from getting in the way of responding to their children's needs. Visit coaching is not just a small improvement in visits. It's really a completely different way of visiting that starts with the original planning process with the parent to help them get ready to make visits good for their children. And in addition to starting differently, the visit coach is actively involved in preparing the parent for each visit, supporting the parent actively during the visit, and debriefing with the parent at the end of the visit. Visit coaching is designed, first of all, to help a parent imagine their child coming into the visit room or wherever they're visiting and asking themselves, what does my child need from me today? And spending the time before visit coaching begins answering that question. It's a much harder question than it sounds. If you imagine picking up a child in your family this afternoon, maybe a child who's had some difficulty today in school, and you ask yourself, what does he or she need from me? It's not the easiest question to answer. And we want parents to be able to know what their child needs before the child comes through that door. We want to prepare parents that their children are reacting to separation and loss, and that what parents tell us is true. My child seems different than he seemed at home. And we confirm that. Your child is different. And that can be hard for you to cope with. And we want to help you be able to understand what your child is going through and meet the emotional needs behind the separation and loss. We help parents recognize that giving their full attention to their children during the visit is what the parent wants to do, not what they're being told to do, because they're often told to do that, but really helping the parent embrace that. The coaching that we do during the visit is based on the strengths of the parent. Each parent responds quite differently to their children. Some parents sing, some parents get down on the floor and play, some parents do a lot of noisy play, some parents like to sit on the couch and snuggle with their child. And we try to build on what their family time was like when they were at home, because it wasn't all bad. And the idea is to help the parent realize that even if you only have 1 hour with your child, you can have your family during that time. And then we work with parents before, during, and after each visit to help them with their own issues, their own problems that could get in the way of the visit. So structurally, visit coaches who could be the caseworker, could be the case aide or other visit specialist, but could be a variety of other individuals who have been trained as visit coaches. It's not limited to people who have done visiting in the past. Structurally, the trained visit coach has a visit plan meeting with the parent before visit coaching begins. And then they have a few minutes before each visit to help the parent get ready to be fully there to meet their child's needs, to get rid of their own issues. Then the coach is in the visit with the parent, and then they have a brief debriefing afterward where the parent and coach can talk about what they'd like to be different in the next visit. This is the training tool, and you can read it more easily on your CD, that we use when training visit coaches, and then they use with their families. Sometimes the way they do this is to take a photo of the parent with their children and put it on a piece of paper with an umbrella over it. The notion of the umbrella that's become very popular in visit coaching is that we help parents talk about what are their issues that are going to come into the visit with them and get in the way of their being able to respond to their children's needs. So the issues of one parent might be that they're very, very angry, and all they want to do is talk about how the children shouldn't have been removed. Another parent might be very envious of the foster parent, and they want to bring up things that the foster parent is doing. The child's hairstyle has been changed. The child's clothes are not the clothes the parent would put on them, and so forth. For some parents, for example, for Nadia's mother, who has a chronic illness, physical illness, she brings that with her when she's going to visit. And that's very much of something that will get in her way. For some parents who are in drug and alcohol treatment and are in recovery, and it's such a fragile new state to be parenting sober for the first time, they often have a lot of guilt and also feel very lacking in self-confidence about how to parent sober. And if they bring all this luggage into the visit room with them, the room gets very crowded with the parents' issues, and it makes it hard for the parent to be there just for the give and take with their own child to meet the needs that they've identified. So we help parents both in the visit plan session and right before the visit picture themselves putting an umbrella up over the visit, and to picture those issues, their anger and sadness and so forth, being rain clouds that are real. And when they leave the visit, the storm is still going to be raging in their life with all the problems that they have. But they can put an umbrella up and keep the visit from having those clouds get in the way of having a fun time with their child. They can make the visit an angry-free or sadness-free visit by their own actions. And throughout the visit, we can give reminders to the parent to keep their umbrella up if their issues start to leak through. But at the same time, in the visit plan meeting and in the visits, we focus on what's underneath the umbrella, those little boxes. Written in those boxes are the needs of each child that the parent has identified with the visit coach. And so the work of and the fun of the visit are for the parent to meet the child's need for reassurance, meet the child's need for attention, meet the child's need for that reciprocal communication that we think is so important in attachment. And of course, we help parents with the very difficult part of giving reassurance to their children at the end of the visit. So what message would I want you to take to your teams about trauma, mitigating trauma reactions in children, and particularly using visits to do so? Well, the first thing I would encourage you to aspire to in your teams is quality family time in visits. All parents require support to meet their children's needs at visits. This is not a parent failing. All of us would need support if we were in the situation of having to meet our children's needs during a visit. We help parents meet their children's needs in visits by helping them understand why they visit and by helping them identify their children's needs so that they can meet them in visits. And we help parents keep their own issues from getting in the way. Does that mean you have to implement visit coaching? Maybe a big question on your mind. And I'm obviously a biased person in that regard. I think visit coaching is designed so specifically to help give parents the support they require to meet their children's needs and keep their issues out, that it can be a very effective approach, and that doing anything less, visit improvement that just increases the quantity of visits or changes the location of visits, those are good things to be doing, but they don't necessarily prepare parents to make visits the place where the trauma of separation and loss is mitigated. You could use some of those other evidence-based programs that I listed as another way to help parents be able to address their children's needs. So I'm not saying you couldn't do other visit improvement other than visit coaching. But there's a lot of information out there available about visit coaching, and a manual for visit coaching is available on my website that would be helpful for you if you want to learn more about how to do visit coaching. Second, I would encourage you to have trauma-informed support for foster parents and relative caregivers. And here I mean more than training. Many relative caregivers don't get much training at all, but even foster parent training is weak in the area of trauma, especially ways that foster parents can identify the trauma-related needs behind a child's behavior and meet them. We cannot assume that foster parents or relative caregivers who are so well motivated and love the children in their care can meet the needs behind a child's behavior, the emotional needs. That requires preparation and support. The most exciting research on this topic, one of those 6 programs that I alluded to, is that a trained person, usually a trained foster parent or a trained relative caregiver, some of whom are actually volunteers doing this work, a trained person making a phone call once a week to every foster parent, every relative caregiver, to talk with them about the behaviors of the children in their home and the needs behind them, and to give them help in how they are responding, but also to give them encouragement to use the team to get additional supports if the child has more needs than the foster parent or relative caregiver can meet, has dramatically reduced placement disruption. Just that one phone call a week. So that's a kind of support that seems very promising. And then third, I would encourage you to triage for those children who really have to have individual trauma treatment, both infant mental health care and trauma treatment for elementary and middle school and high school children. Now, trauma treatment isn't just counseling, but it is easy for qualified mental health professionals to get certified to deliver trauma treatment in individual therapy sessions. And some of the evidence-based trauma treatment practices are only 16 or 20 sessions long. It's not like the child has to be in therapy for forever. But they are specifically designed not to focus on the annoying or problematic behaviors of the child, but rather to help the child come to terms with the trauma and other losses that they've experienced. Most trauma treatment also includes a family component, but it's crucial that child welfare signal to the therapist, and particularly if Medicaid is paying for it, let the therapist know Medicaid will pay for collateral work with both the foster parent or relative caregiver and the parent. So you could have the therapists delivering this support during visits of the child and the parent, but alternatively, you could be asking therapists in their normal course of trauma treatment, when they would invite the caregiver in, to educate them about the child's trauma reactions and what they can be doing at home, which is frequently done just with the foster parent now. That the parent also have those sessions monthly, because that all applies to what the parent is doing with the child in visits and what the parent will do in if the child is reunified. I would strongly urge you to do all three of these things. To invest in quality family time and visits, to invest in trauma-informed support for foster parents and relative caregivers, and to find individual therapy for children who are most in need. And as part of your effort to involve foster parents and parents in better communication, which you could see as a fourth thing to do, or you could see it as part of quality family time and trauma-informed support, but I would encourage you to have that communication. And I want to commend Blair County for the work that they're doing, because they are tackling both visit improvement through visit coaching, and by doing Bridging the Gap, they're connecting foster parents and parents. And what I heard this morning, which is making me really pleased about your outcomes, is a report that caseworkers and case aides are seeing a difference in visits and are happier as a result with their work. And we definitely want caseworkers and case aides to be happier about the work that they're doing, since it's so important. Thank you very much.